Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very good afternoon, very good morning or evening, depending on which part of the world you're located at. My name is Dr. Nariman Hashhamu, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Learning Innovations and Customized Knowledge Solutions. And I'm delighted to welcome you all in our fourth and last panel for this academic year of the In Conversation with Click series of virtual panel. Our panel today is organized under the theme, how should the higher education sector adapt to the new modern workforce? And it will be chaired by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Marco Savic, who I will introduce in a few minutes. In this particular panel, we will be looking at how COVID-19 pandemic is impacting the future of workforce and the role that universities and higher education institutions can play. We will try to address the key factors driving the need for micro-credentials and digital badges. And our international panel of experts will share some examples and good practices drawing from different contexts. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, CLIX has launched this series of panels a few weeks ago in line with its mission statement of supporting the healthy growth and development of the higher education sector. We aim at providing a platform where our community can come together to share practices and have in-depth discussions around planning the future of higher education post the COVID-19 pandemic. We are delighted to have with us today colleagues from more than 40 countries, including the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, the USA, the UK, Ireland, among many others. May I remind our participants that they will be able to interact and ask questions using the Q&A feature that is available. Kindly do not use the chat function, as it would be very difficult for our panelists to look at both the Q&A and the chat session. Towards the end of the session, our panel chair will try to address the questions. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to our silver sponsor for our series of panels, the Agence des Universités Francophones, or the Association of French-Speaking Universities. Now, without any further delay, may I take this opportunity to introduce our panel chair, Dr. Marco Savic. Dr. Marco Savic is the Senior Manager at the Strategy and Future Department at the Higher Colleges of Technology in the UAE, one of the largest higher education and pioneering institutions in the country. He has been working for 3 decades within diverse post-secondary institutions at different academic and executive leadership posts in both Europe and the United Arab Emirates, participating in several systematic and institutional academic transformation, including the Bologna process in Europe, higher education reforms in Serbia, and the qualification framework Emirates. At his current position, beside the main role of international relations, Dr. Marco is coordinating the institutional education to employment focal strategy and next generation micro-credential learning services project at his institutions, both focusing on developing collaborative, comprehensive learning ecosystem adjusted to the 21st century needs. I will now hand over to our panel chair for today, and I will see you again at the end of our panel. Enjoy this panel. Dr. Marco?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nariman, for the brief introduction. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending where you are. Before introducing the panel consisting from academicians from 4 different continents, I would like to stress a few extraordinary things. Do you remember any academic-related event held mid-July? Me neither. In all normal, during this part of the year, most of us will enjoy our vacation. Second point is that also in all normal, panelists would join me here at the stage, but you are quite aware that it would not be the case today. So it seems that old normal is over and new normal is here to stay. Since the dawn of 4th industrial revolution, we are witnessing disruptive technologies and other interconnected trends that are quickly changing the way how we live and work. And technological change induces shifts in occupational structures, transforming demand for skills and competencies at a faster pace than ever before. Some estimations are that the future labor market will generate 85% of the jobs by 2030 that are not even invented yet. The artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, augmented and virtual reality, all these elements are already embedded into our daily routines, bringing simultaneous joy to our lives, as well as fear of unknown. At the same time, people live and work longer. Such extensive transformations of the global socio-economic ecosystem is forcing higher education to reconsider traditional models in order to respond and address emerging expectations. Now we have COVID-19 pandemic, global crisis, which additionally emphasize on vulnerability of the current educational models. Affecting every single element of the academic life, it raises substantial academic, financial, ethical, and operational questions and triggers rethinking the basic assumptions and values of the higher education institutions. Micro-credentials, defined as a competency-based digital form of certification indicating fitness for a job, are one of the emerging trends with the post-secondary education sector that has been driven by the growing disconnect between employers' needs and what graduates possess as skills. Having in mind dynamics of the industry transformation and increased human longevity, such as approach tends to respond to the emerging trends and changes of the 21st century workforce demand. At this point, I'm happy to introduce 4 distinguished panelists who will join me during next bit more than 1 hour to debate key factors driving a need for micro-credentials, presenting some of the global best practices, and discuss the impact of this trend to the future transformations of the post-secondary education. So I have with me today Dr. Kathleen Ives, joining us from USA. Good morning, Dr. Kathleen.
Good morning.
Dr. Kathleen has worked in online technology for over 30 years and currently serves as a Director of Higher Education Transformation at the National Laboratory for Education Transformation. She also serves as a member of PACBEC Academic Innovation Board, an AI-powered inquiry-driven learning platform, as well as adjunct faculty at multiple institutions. Dr. Ives is a Senior Fellow for Professional Development for the University Professional and Continuing Education Association and co-editor and chapter author of the recently published book, Leading the E-Learning Transformation of Higher Education, Leadership Strategies for the Next Generation. Formerly, she served as the CEO and as Executive Director of the Online Learning Consortium. Second panelist is Ms. Shrouk Zidan, joining us from Egypt. Good afternoon, Ms. Shrouk.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Shrouk is Partner, International Development and Behavior Change at the Envisage Consulting and former Executive Director of the Egyptian Technical and Vocational Education and Training Reform Program. She has worked with various international organizations throughout the Middle East and Africa on developing and managing international development programs that advocate for and ensure sustainable initiatives. Throughout her work experience, she has focused on the combination of best practices from various disciplines and has spent the majority of her career committed to solving critical social problems in strategic regions around the world to foster lasting impact using frameworks and processes necessary to create and support system-wide change. Third panelist, which would join us today, is Professor Maurice van Rooyen, joining us from Germany. Good afternoon, Professor Maurice.
Actually, I'm in London at the moment, but it doesn't matter. It's for a German institution.
We got stuck in different countries depending on the situation, I understand that. Professor Maurice studied and lectured at Utrecht University before joining the Erasmus University Rotterdam. In 1993, he moved to the University of Westminster, London, from which he retired as Executive Vice President when he took up the position of Rector Magnificus and CEO of the Dutch Corporate Leadership University, Nieuwenrode. In 2012, he joined forces with the entrepreneur Aaron Ettingen in creating global university systems, where he currently serves as the Group Chief Academic Officer, as well as Rector of one of the group member institutions, the University of Applied Sciences in Germany. Prof. Maurice has held visiting and honorary appointments at universities around the world in his academic field, which is sustainable urbanization, nearby my architecture, so I understand this area very much, and has published widely on international education and on university management. He is the former president of the Compostela Group of Universities and long-serving co-chairman of the World Association for Cooperative and Work-Integrated Learning. And last, but not least, member of this panel is Professor Mark Brown, joining us from Ireland.
Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon, Professor Mark. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Professor Mark is director of the National Institute for Digital Learning at Dublin City University and Ireland's first full professor of digital learning. He is a fellow and a member of the executive committee of the European Distance and E-Learning Network. In addition, Professor Mark serves on the supervisory board of the European Association of Distance Teaching Universities and is a member of the executive committee of the Open Distance Learning Association of Australia. In recent years, he has been associated with several micro-credentials, including the European Consortium of Innovative Universities and Common European Micro-Credential Framework. He is co-author of the major report of the future of alternative digital credential published by the International Council for Open and Distance Education and currently serves on the European Commission's consultation group of micro-credentials. Additionally, Professor Brown has played a leadership role in the launch of the Dublin City University's first credit-bearing micro-credential on the Future Learn platform. So, before proceeding with the first question, I would like to launch first poll and inquire our audience about understanding what is the main rationale behind the emerging micro-credentials and digital badging trend. I hope that you can see the poll and you can see the optional answers. So please feel free and respond to this in next 30 seconds. Okay, it's going well. Okay, about 60% of attendees voted. Let's give a few more seconds. Okay, I will freeze it here. Let's see the results. So, digitization of learning delivery, aligning with regularly updated labor market expectations, evolving institutional operational models, optimization of service cost, personalization of learning. I'm reading all of those because most of above got the most of the votes, almost 50% of our active attendees. So, sorry, I didn't share those results immediately. I read it, but I didn't click the button. Now you can see it, I suppose. So my consideration was that definitely all of those factors are involved in building this trend. However, it is interesting to see how our attendees are considering micro-credentials. It seems that based on number of, let's say, active attendees, that there are some who would like to hear more about this topic, and I'm very happy to provide more information along with the panelists. So let's stop sharing results and let's begin with our panel conversation. So my first question for all of the panelists would be, what are the key drivers behind the emerging intent to shorten learning cycles and redefine approach to learning pathways, and how do you understand or approach or implement micro-credentials to respond to labor market needs? I would invite Professor Maurice to begin with responding to this question.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I mean, if you were to be entirely rational about it, you could say that the way we organize teaching nowadays is very archaic almost, right? It is many years of study at a young age where we are supposed to know everything we need to know, and then we graduate and off you go in society and you know everything you need to know for a successful career. And that is, in all fairness, an outdated model. Micro-credentials definitely is a very powerful tool to rejuvenate the learning model and actually say, no, this is what we always been saying, it's lifelong learning. It is in a modern economy, the only way to learn, and that is continuously learn rather than just do it as one short period of time. Having said that, as I'm sure will come up during this panel as well, that is only one assessment, the rational assessment. This is makes a lot of sense to do it that way, but I doubt it's going to be the big revolution, and in a couple of years you will find that micro-credentials take over and there is no need for conventional education anymore. So I do not know, Marco, whether you want me to expand a little bit more on that, or whether you just want to leave it at this stage as a kickoff.
Please continue. Please
Sorry.
continue.
Okay, in that case, well, great, I love it. I mean, that's my favorite phrase, Marco. Please continue. You should never have to say that twice to a university president, I can promise you. Now you lost your total 50 minutes of seminar. But no, I mean, obviously, it's very impressive, the innovative work which is being done at micro-credentials. And if we did a quick poll now and say, raise your hand who is against it, I doubt you will get many people who say this is a rubbish idea, let's not do it, right? It makes a lot of sense rationally. Yet, if we all agree that it's difficult to be against the principle of micro-credentials, why is there still clearly opposition? Why isn't it actually taking over the world of higher education? Now, partly that is because there is political resistance, vested interests, protectionism even when it comes to the international domain, which is understandable. It's a bit like the introduction of Uber you know, it makes a lot of sense to have an Uber system, but you know, when you have a regulated sector with taxis and so on, you will find it's not that easy to break into. I can promise you higher education even more regulated, therefore it's actually not that simple to suddenly change it from one thing to another. But that's the political vested interest, and in some ways you can deal with that. It's just hard work to break through the barriers. But the other one is more difficult, and that is the emotional resistance. And that is based on conservatism and prejudice as well, right? Education is based on perception. And what is the perception of micro-credits, right? What is the perception there? What is, and I think that is really the key question. It is very cost effective, which is another way of saying it's cheap. And cheap in education isn't necessarily a positive thing. You know, we all know that when you pay more, it represents higher quality, normally, in perception. I know that's not rationality, it's not the facts, but that's the perception. It is often seen as a second choice for those who do not go into the proper education track of going to a nice, well-regarded university, but actually go for micro-credentials instead, for those who can actually not do the full proper education work, right? Which is a deadly you know, perception, because you do not want to be second or third choice. You want to be first choice, right? And yet that is still the perception. No leading university, to my knowledge, have embraced it and said, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Why are we still teaching in the old-fashioned way? So there is no endorsement there at the top level, which again doesn't help with the perception. It's new, which normally should excite us all, because it's a new modern way of approaching education. But higher education in general is actually based very much on history. It takes centuries to be really respectable. If an institution is less than 50 years old, it's still considered a startup in education, right? So, wow, new is not necessarily good in terms of reputation and gaining knowledge. So the challenge for us is not to fool ourselves and just look at the rational arguments why this is so good, but actually also embrace the question, what do we need to do in order to make it emotionally exciting and change the perception about microcredits? If you do not break that one, it's not going to be a quick win soon.
Thank you very much, Maurice.
You want to say more? Can I go on? I can happily go on for another 10 minutes.
No, thank you. It was absolutely sharp in 5 minutes. Dr. Caitlin, what is your opinion about the question?
So you had asked about drivers, Dr. Marcos. I wanted to talk about two drivers with regards to micro-credentials. The first is COVID in the United States. And the second driver I wanted to talk a little bit about is the belief that employers do not feel that colleges are adequately preparing students. And so when you look at COVID in the United States, and I'm sure it's happening in every other country, but specifically, we're being severely constrained about being able to offer core services, right? Our financial health, the fallout has been swift and substantial. The credit agency Moody's Analytics has downgraded the outlook for American higher ed from stable to negative. The projected revenue losses are huge. For example, $25 million at George Washington University, $66 million at the University of Arizona. And the American Council on Education estimates that higher educations overall in the U.S. are going to need over $34.6 billion to address revenue shortfalls. And prior to that, the states had already been implementing their own cuts. Now, institutions are getting some relief from the government through what they call the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, but it's still not enough. And so the 5 near-term challenges for us are going to be student retention in online programs, persistence and progress during remote learning, incoming classes and overall enrollments. How are we going to sustain that? The auxiliaries and fee-supported activities like residence halls and dining services and athletics, those are all going away. The challenges of opening safely, and I'm sure, again, all of you are experiencing that. The logistics and challenges are huge. And then what if there's a recurrence? So all of these are one driver that's impacting micro-credentials. The second really is, as I mentioned before, is that employers are just not believing in the value of college anymore in the U.S. They feel that colleges don't equip new hires with basic technical and practical skills. For example, let's say you're studying computer programming. You're not coming into that job with the specific programming skills required to do that job. Colleges are also being told that they also don't equip new hires with soft skills like collaboration and problem solving. And they're not being practiced. So that's another concern. And even before the crisis, there were concerns rising about a potential loss of jobs and the rising demand for digital skills due to technologies such as automation and AI. So what we're finding is that, while some economic disruptions and job losses will be temporary, we must recognize that this is a major structural shift that's putting an even greater premium on education. And this is where you can see how micro-credentials can come in. We need to take a step back and examine how this post-pandemic economy and post-secondary ecosystem are evolving as they move online. And even before the pandemic, work-based learning models such as internships and apprenticeships were already growing in popularity. The challenge now is that they're all being transformed to online. So what colleges and universities and corporations are looking at is a model that deviates, as was said by our previous panelists, from a 4-year model and more in favor of lifelong learning. And we can get people out into the job market more quickly. So a more agile model to education. And stackable micro-credentials can offer a win-win outcome, right? Because the employer might sponsor a work-related certificate, but the employee also has the ability to stack on that and earn a degree at a later point in time if necessary. Here in the US, we're seeing a growth in corporate-issued credentials, notably from companies like IBM and Google. And the key to their success is to create an ecosystem that's going to allow individuals to chart even more varied, and the word I want to emphasize is personalized pathways to credential attainment. Colleges and universities, again, before COVID, were focusing on micro-credentials, but now it's becoming even more important. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for example, was one of the first colleges to partner with edX to offer a micromaster's degree. You've got Colorado State offering soft skill badges. You've got Illinois State offering more than 7,000 digital badges, and our community college system in California is offering 21st century skill badges. So the momentum is continuing. One of the most recent collaborations was something called the University Learning Store, which is 7 colleges that have got together to enabling students to buy courses from them. And they're pretty reasonable, from $25 to $150 with a 3 to 30 hour investment. So micro-credentials are gaining popularity, and I think, again, with the drivers that I mentioned, the pandemic and the employers seeking to get individuals into the job market very quickly, we've kind of hit a perfect storm here.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Professor Mark, can you give us a bit about European Union experience on micro-credentials current moment?
Yes, well, thank you. And thanks to the previous 2 panelists to help identify some of the drivers. From my perspective, I think it's best to describe that there are a collation of, or almost a cluster of competing and coexisting drivers, and that they're not all in alignment. And I say that because even in the work we're doing on the European Commission's consultation group, where we want to agree on a common definition, because this is actually something I've posted in the chat box, there isn't a common definition across the globe. So even amongst the consultation group in our work, we haven't been able yet to come up with a common definition of what we mean. Are they stackable, or are they just warm body badges in many cases? Certainly not, I hope, from the perspective that I take. Just to elaborate on some of those drivers, although Stephen Downes makes quite a nice distinction between drivers and attractors. So some are pushing and others are pulling. And you could almost argue actually that COVID-19 is a pull rather than a push, or it's probably a combination of both. The first point I want to state is that the micro-credentialing movement, regardless of definition and what we mean by that, is part of the unbundling movement. And unbundling has occurred in many walks of our life and society and economy. And education has arguably been one of the least disruptive to the unbundling movement in the past. So along with the digital disruption that was mentioned at the outset, we should acknowledge that no change or disruption is entirely benign. And that I mentioned because one of the drivers can be seen as what is often labeled as neoliberal, about creating and responding to market forces in education. Actually, MOOCs have been quite influential in the micro-credentialing movement. Based on an analysis from Class Central earlier in the year, there are about 800 micro-credentials offered on the main MOOC platforms. And whilst they don't have to be exclusively online, we often talk about digital badges and having an online or a digital dimension. So that movement on MOOCs is very much about a global market, not just serving local needs, but creating a global market for education. Not everyone would agree with that. And in addition, another driver linked to this is around giving learners pathways. Kathleen mentioned about personalized pathways. And I certainly wouldn't argue against giving such pathways for individuals, but there is another view from a neoliberal view of the world where this is a bit like putting the learner in the supermarket and allowing them to choose what's on the shelf themselves. Instead of institutions, universities bundling what we think might be the best curriculum for a particular pathway. Now, these are not mutually exclusive arguments. There is middle ground in this, but the supermarket analogy is interesting because sometimes when I go to the supermarket, I do buy things that are probably not that healthy for me. And maybe I'm not always the best person to choose what I buy, but that's a very unpopular argument. You can't argue that these days in many respects. So there are competing drivers. There's also a driver for more flexibility. a mobility of people mean that increasingly, particularly at postgraduate level, people want to earn where they learn. Bite-sized parts of learning and chunks of learning, obviously on the job, just enough, just in time learning. So there are drivers for learners themselves, putting aside some of those more macro level drivers that I was talking about. So all in all, this is a lot more complex than most people think, and it's certainly not just something about creating badges and issuing them. This is a deep change to the ecology of higher education. Change doesn't happen quickly. Not every institution is predisposed for the change. And I think what's really important for me in these discussions is understanding the why before we get into the how. And so I think it's really important that we have more of these discussions around getting the drivers right. So I'll stop on that note. Well, maybe one last final point, and this is a little bit of a slogan in some respects, but I still think it has merit. Micro-credentials should be in the service of big ideas. They are not the big idea themselves. So often when I'm thinking about micro-credentials, I'm thinking about how they can advance the big ideas we have for education: accessibility, reducing the cost of education, enhancing the quality of education, and ultimately advancing sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it was really insightful, especially the topic about unbundling movement. Really, at this point, if we think about common process of designing, launching, and delivering a bachelor program, common bachelor program, you need about a year or two to prepare a good program, to accredit it initially, to deliver it first time, to test the results through the first batch of graduates. It will take you 6 to 7 years minimum. Just imagine how industry in certain sectors looked like 7 years ago. So things are changing so quickly that really there is an issue with big bundles of learning services we are offering currently, and I clearly agree with you that it should be unbundled at some point, as well as that shouldn't be a LARP or LART. It should be in the service of bigger ideas rather than just introducing some hype new product. In addition to this, one of the very important questions for me is, what is the relation between the higher or academic education and vocational education? And I would like to ask Ms. Shuruk, what is her experience from the vocational sector? How you consider drivers for micro-credentialing from your point of view?
Thank you, Marco, very much. And this is a very interesting discussion. Of course, from the vocational and technical education and training perspective, we can look at micro-credentials. This is something that is already that has been ongoing in the technical education in particular, and also for vocational training, those that have graduated from technical education and are ready to move on to the labor market. However, today with the COVID dilemma that we are currently facing, and the fact that there is a lot of unemployment that is has hit us pretty hard and has hit the economy pretty hard, there are several models that we have to look at and start to move towards. For example, over the last couple of years, Egypt has set up technology universities that are competency-based and support the technical education system and the technical education reform that is taking place, whereby they look at the skill sets that are required in the marketplace, and they look at the different occupations that are taking place or that are needed, not just at the national level or community level, but also internationally. And they start to see how they can take it one step further. Be it to meet the fourth industrial revolution or even digitalization of certain aspects of these skill sets. But for vocational and technical education, we cannot move 100% towards digitalization. We have to always take into consideration that there is the aspect of apprenticeships that have to take place, the aspect of practicality that these students have to look into, and therefore they are now looking at how to set up vocational training centers that are within or embedded within the universities that will not only allow university students to start acquiring vocational skill sets that are necessary and that would help support the mid-level occupations that are urgently needed in the market, but also allows those that have graduated to be certified via be it a private sector and also recognized by a national university or a national institution. So this is something that is interesting and that is happening at the moment. And the other thing that is important and maybe we haven't yet taken forward or haven't yet really touched on is what is the role of the private sector. Having the private sector be able to issue some sort of certification and such as that is already taking place in the German system via existing business chambers or some sort of existing professional bodies. This also helps somewhat in the recognition of these kinds of certification aspects. One of the key things of reform that has been ongoing and changing this perception of that it's only about getting a bachelor's degree or getting a higher education degree has always been the involvement of the private sector to participate in the learning experience or in the experiential learning perspective of the students. And this has become something that is very popular these days. And also with the COVID-19, soft skill sets or life skills are also being provided via internationally recognized institutions that offer, online certification, and therefore it makes it, easier for them to enhance their resumes, or makes it easier for them to say, okay, they have a better and higher opportunity of getting employment and getting employed. The other thing that I believe is really of relevance is what type of micro-credentials are we offering? Are we offering something that is of relevance to the local markets, or are we offering something of relevance to the international markets? So looking at this and starting to look at the traditional occupations and looking at the how can we upgrade these kind of occupations and what can we integrate in terms of skills. I think this is also where micro-credentials will start playing a very relevant role.
Thank you very much. I would like to add to this question to other panelists another inquiry. Especially in, let's say, most developed industrial countries in Europe, such as Germany, or Finland, or Netherlands, or Ireland, there is a span of different types of post-secondary education modes or models. And if we take a look at this span from the vocational through applied or technical education towards academic education, do you think that micro-credentials could be a fil rouge, which would connect all of those types of education at some point and bring them together towards the main goal we are discussing now, and this is getting the employment opportunities. I would like to hear from Mark and Maurice a bit about it, if you don't mind. Mark, can you give us a few thoughts?
Sure, I'll go first then. I think the first thing that's important is having a framework to operate within, and I note there are a few questions about frameworks in the Q&A. We're fortunate in many respects in Ireland because we have a national qualification framework that has a provision that accommodates micro-credentials that can be stackable and credit-bearing. And I think in my own understanding of micro-credentials, recognizing I said there isn't a common language yet, I really distinguish between a type 1 and a type 2 form of credential, mini micro-credential. And the type 1 for me is stackable and credit-bearing. And I think that's really crucial. You might say that's sort of on an x-axis, if people can visualize this, and that's about promoting lifelong learning on a vertical x-axis. The type 2 form of micro-credential perhaps is more around informal and non-formal learning, and that's on the horizontal axis, life-wide learning, if you like. Perhaps better seen, I'm going to mix metaphors, like a honeycomb, where the learner fills in gaps, but those are not necessarily stackable in the way that I described by type 1. Now that's a very crude distinction, because there are ways in which informal learning experiences can actually contribute by portfolio into a formal stackable qualification. So it's quite blurred in many respects, but I like to try to keep it as simple as possible. Now, the question about frameworks, though, is also becomes crucial in the European context, because we operate to the European qualification framework as well. And the work that's going on with the European Commission right now, last week launched the new skills agenda for Europe, and action 10 in that skills agenda is the development of a European approach to micro-credentials. And the commitment of the group that I'm part of is to get our common understanding of micro-credentials embedded and aligned into the European qualification framework. And that will privilege, I have to say, although I'm getting ahead of the work, much more stackable formal and non-formal forms of micro-credential, or shall we say learning experiences that have an assessment and then a credit weighting to them. That doesn't remove or lessen necessarily the value of the life-wide learning experiences, learning things out of interest, because there is another agenda here going on, and a tension, if you like. Universities are not necessarily just work factories for the new economy. They have a societal function. And again, that's not mutually exclusive from the economic vocational agenda. People want jobs, but also there is a role for promoting lifelong learning for the challenges we face in humanity currently. And if we don't have people who are engaged and have places to learn and generate new knowledge, then where else will that happen? So I think we have to be careful that these are not just purely vocational drivers. A long-winded answer, but frameworks are crucial, in short.
Thank you. Professor Maurice.
Right. Well, first of all, I agree with everything Mark said. It is a very rich environment, and you can look at micro-credentials in many different ways. And in that case, you want to simplify it as much as possible. And for me, I simplify it as what does it mean at the micro level as an individual? What does it actually gain using micro-credentials as an individual in my development? And the other one is the more formal question of how does it fit in with, you know, the formal credit-bearing education? And can it fit in, or does it not fit in? And can it be a unifier, as you said, Marco? And those are actually not necessarily the same questions. For the first question, in some ways, you can be highly successful without ever getting a bachelor or master's, etc. And micro-credentials can help there. And you could say, therefore, that is not the most relevant discussion. But the other discussion is a very pragmatic one, and that is, if it's not credit bearing, if it's extracurricular, micro-credentials actually can be very, very important, and can also be a unifier, as you called it, Marco, across the section. And in one of the questions that I think it was Maruf who reminded us, for instance, on the code boot camps, how this worked very well with universities, but basically, and I look, for instance, at the example Dan Summers did in the US with Trology. You put the boot camp, you embed them on the campuses of prestigious universities, and students can take it, and hey, they earn the betting from, hey, I know coding, and coding is pretty important. Now, universities want to go at a higher level. They are not particularly bothered about teaching coding, but they do appreciate there's a value in learning coding, because it enhances your professional value. And therefore, they allow it, and they even endorse it, and in some extreme cases, they might even consider giving some credits for it. It enriches their landscape. From the student point of view, it's clear investment in a career, but it doesn't upset the system as a whole. Of course, what Dan was smart in, what I said, is he embedded those boot camps in prestigious universities. Coming back to the point I made initially, hey guys, this is education. You need to build up credibility. And you can do that by, for instance, associating yourself with top brands. So I think you're absolutely right, Marco. It can be a unifier, but then more as extra badges, as extracurricular. And if you get credits for it, it's a nice extra, but it's not actually the main purpose. An alternative approach is get the reputation from the corporate sector. I mean, you're absolutely right, Hiroki, to say include the private sector. Even though universities, of course, have the right on giving the degrees and therefore control the credits, actually, when it comes to employability and so on, a brand like whatever, McKinsey or Deloitte or whatever brand you want to use, is just as important, if sometimes not more important, than actual formal endorsement of a university, and that we should not underestimate either.
Thank you very much. Before I proceed to the next question for our panelists, I would just like to remind all the audience that you can address the questions in QA option below. And again, to apologize that to those who are watching on Facebook or YouTube, that we will not be able to follow up with their comments, at least in real time. But if there would be some interesting points, we would try to respond to them after this session. So I would just like to continue with this discussion with Dr. Kathleen and Ms. Shuruk. We are talking about unified micro-credentialing frameworks. We are talking about different currencies which may be used to quantify the success of learning through micro-credentials. Do you see really micro-credentials as enablers to establish more connection between the countries, between the systems, between the learning modes, and if it is so, how you see that it may happen in the near future? Kathleen.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about this by looking at the whole notion of artificial intelligence as enabling micro-credentialing. And the way that I'd like to approach it is by looking at both the intelligent campus, which would be institutional and student support, and also personalized learning. So if you look at the intelligent campus and institutional, what we're seeing in the US is that AI is becoming relied on substantially more for marketing to prospective students, estimating class sizes, planning curriculum, allocating resources such as financial aid and facilities. And we can see that bleeding over into the whole micro-credentialing arena. The same goes for student support. Schools are using machine learning now in student guidance, and some applications are helping students automatically schedule their course load. Others are recommending majors and career paths, and others are capturing data profiles. So let's say a student was working on a micro-credential, but they weren't exactly they weren't mastering it, it'll be able to direct them into an area which is perhaps more suited to their knowledge and their competencies. And finally, predictive analytics is being used in student support for early warning systems, analyzing a wide array of data. And again, we can see that happening with regards to artificial intelligence and micro-credentials as well. The final thing is something I'm a little bit passionate about, and that's the whole instructional piece with regards to self-paced, and Mark has touched on it as well, and personal learning, because now you can apply artificial intelligence in instruction. And so what this involves is creating systems that are responding to individuals' needs and progress. So let's talk about motivation. So micro-credentials powered by AI can provide support during a particularly challenging program, or provide personalized indicators to completion and help with some of the data-driven decision-making. Also, micro-credentials, again, we're seeing this in the regular curriculum, but you can envision it in micro-credentialing, is documentation, providing breadcrumbs, if you will, around the path to learning outcomes, assessments to help students better internalize and articulate the skills they have mastered, and it better positions students for forward movement. As Dr. Marco mentioned in my introduction, I currently work with a company called PackBack. It's an artificial intelligence supported online discussion platform that improves student critical thinking, curiosity, and writing skills. And this also lends itself to micro-credentialing. Here in the US, about 500,000 students have been using PackBack since May of 2016, and over 1,500 instructors have been using PackBack. And essentially what it does is it prioritizes the skills over the degrees. Essentially the applications of AI and natural language processing around the open-ended question that can allow us to quantify critical thinking, which is why many colleges and universities are turning to artificial intelligence and tools like PackBack because of that. And again, you can see how it could naturally progress into the micro-credentialing program area.
Thank you very much, Shruk. As I was working both in academic and vocational sector, I really recognize a lot of similarity, especially in the current moment, and especially in the field which we are primarily discussing. Of course, as Mark mentioned, I'm not doubting that higher education has some other roles than finding an employment for the graduates, and that would remain as such in future for sure. But if you see vocational education as something which provides more practical, applicable knowledge, comparing to academic education, which provides more theoretical knowledge in the same discipline, do you think that those two streams may get more together?
I do. First, I'm not sure I want to make this distinction, because when you look at vocational education, you're really looking at competencies. You want to measure competencies, and you want to assess these competencies in accordance to certain standards. And these standards are not just recognized by national bodies, but they also need to be recognized by international bodies, like any degrees that are attained. And this is where I think this is where the link comes into, you know, the use of micro-credentials and linking to international markets, or having this kind of recognitions on the international markets. For vocational training measures and assesses these skill sets, and it doesn't only assess the skill sets from the practical perspective, but it also assesses the theoretical aspect. So when we look at a student or a program that has been transformed to become a competency-based training or a competency-based education program, you have two sets of assessments. You have the assessment perspective that comes from the private sector, and the private sector says, yes, this individual has the necessary skill sets that I'm looking for a particular job. And you also have the assessment that comes from the teacher themselves, or those that measure the learning aspect or the learning curve of these students. And it is the same for technology universities or the higher education perspective of vocational and technical education. However, we have to agree that when you look at big names and big brands, they each have their own micro-credential sets of training programs that they expect their new hire or existing employees to undergo. And they may not necessarily be of relevance to the market in general. And this is one perspective that we have to really look at. So you need to link the different standards of the new occupations that are required, maybe not for the bigger names, but rather for small and medium enterprises that are ready to, to take whatever skill sets that are going to be offered via micro-credentials into the marketplace. Yeah, that's it really.
This is for sure one very important side of the story. When you're talking about big names and their training programs, yes, of course, companies are targeting what they need. But if we put ourselves in the shoes of learners, as a learner taking those skill sets, you are getting stuck with the needs of a particular company. Maybe some of those skills are transferable, but programs themselves are very tailored towards the needs of those companies. So yes, we are all aware that higher education is losing its monopoly, which lasted for centuries, and that some other institutions are getting into the market. And I would tackle this through our latest question during this panel. But really, I appreciate this discussion about connecting the modes, because definitely we are all trying to reach certain targets. For most of the youth, target is employment. For some, of course, there are some higher level targets or different level targets, but if you are putting or counting what is value for money, and if you're trying to reach to the point that you're self-sustainable in financing your learning, which is one of the, let's say, key issues in the States nowadays, you have to think how to go step by step through this lifelong learning pathway, how to adapt to different milestones which would change throughout your maybe 60 years long career, not 40 years as we used to. So there are a lot of things which we have to take in consideration. I would like to launch another pool, if you don't mind. And this one would be how micro-credentials may disrupt higher education as we know it today. So please take your vote. few more seconds. Okay, let's stop here and share the results. So shifting strongly towards employability and emphasizing lifelong and life-wide learning are the answers that got most of the votes. By purpose, I put also decreasing quality of education. There are some doubts definitely that embedding micro-credentials within a current degree-oriented system may inflate higher education value. As well as mentioned, inflate also the position of higher education institutions. So we have both sides. We have positive and negative thoughts how change may affect us. And it's normal from my point of view. Every change is always challenge, and every challenge may go to any of directions. So let's see where it will take us, and let's continue our wonderful discussion. So the next question I have, and that will be the last question from my side before we get to questions from the audience, would relate to something we already started to discuss. So we are witnessing that some of the key companies in their sectors, and someone mentioned already IBM, Google, or Ernst & Young, or McKinsey, are shifting towards skilling their own employees. And in addition, we have also witnessed recent US presidential decree prioritizing skills over degrees when it comes to employment of the federal officials. So having that in mind, what are your thoughts, and at what extent micro-credentials may redefine mainstream higher education model, or how the formal higher learning institutions shall react to that trend, and what may be the consequences of ignoring that trend? Professor Maurice.
Right. Obviously, predicting the future is a nasty business, but let me say, in principle, institutions evolve. Institutions are not stuck. They do evolve. They can be a rapid evolution, and there can be a revolution. Evolve as in a slow adjustment to this is very risky for institutions. If they are too slow to adopt the badging, the professional focus, etc., they are at risk of marginalizing themselves in the education field. And Marco, you referred to that, how companies are stepping into this domain because basically universities are not doing it. But there are other examples like where in the rankings, conceptual education, research-led institutions and so on score much higher than professional education. Many students with the excellent academic qualifications who could easily go for a more prestigious university in an academic sense actually decide to go for a professional institution because they feel a career focus is really what they want rather than a broader education. A revolution is less likely to happen, sadly. In higher education, they very rarely happen. Having said that, I do have some hope that certainly also now with the COVID-19, some shakeups will happen. And the reasons for that, let's say, optimism for some changes in higher education is that I think there's a broad recognition that the way we managed with everything in the 20th century, which is very much about creating a neat landscape, very compartmentalized, very well organized, clear orders, very much everything in boxes, accredited, etc. A beautiful, neat, clean landscape with clear disciplines and all very nicely divided, actually isn't really that suitable anymore for the reality. And what's happening at the moment, for instance, with virtual learning and so on, annoyingly for many regulators, etc., doesn't tick the right boxes because it doesn't exist even, right? It is either online or it is traditional face-to-face. And what you see from this is that this thinking, this 20th century tools of how we address the problems and challenges in our society aren't actually that effective anymore. And what we really need is a much more fluid approach, what I call open plan and open-ended when it comes to education, where people can go for the more blue sky approach, the conceptual approach, as well as very practical approach. They don't actually finish their education when they get a piece of paper and they know everything for the rest of their life. It's another approach to higher education, which is much more fitting for the century we live in. And that fluid, open plan, open-ended approach to higher education, that certainly sits well with things like micro-credentials and so on, and would be a powerful tool in that approach, freeing it up out of these little compartments and boxes and so on. Now that's the big revolution, which I do not expect universities are going to embrace, or their parents or the students, in the very near future. Even currently, when it comes to the introduction of virtual learning and so on, well, I obviously plan not to mention President Trump, but here we have it. I mean, his tweet about saying, go back to campus because the only real learning experience is on campus, face to face, you know, shows already it needs to be put back in that box. And actually many students and parents probably would agree with that. It's not a criticism, it's a reality. I said earlier, when I said the challenges we have to face, we should not just all sit around here and say this is a great thing and we all agree with each other and we all believe and we are in positive mode and it's all wonderful. We also have to face the realities, and that is you are a disruptor with micro-credentials. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to be smart in how you do the description. So it needs to be part, as Mark also said, of a great vision, something more powerful than just the mechanics of it. It needs to be smart in how you get into institutions, as I said, maybe through the back door as add-ons, maybe also embrace an existing institution with a historical name and reputation, which can award credits, which can then much more easily be recognized by other universities because it's another higher education institution, rather than just trying to get into the more abstract discussion of, hey, here we have micro-credentials, aren't they a wonderful thing? There will be skepticism initially because it is disruptive.
Before I give floor to Mark, just one more question to you, Maurice. Do you think that micro-credentials can support some of initiatives you were highly involved? I'm talking about the university consortia. And
yeah, yes, I mean, one of the reasons why I moved after many years having worked in traditional universities and also public universities into the private sector is because it gives me more freedom to do things and to be innovative. What I get excited about global university systems, which in itself is already a highly innovative model which hasn't existed yet, and that is we create a university system with all kind of different types of institutions, with the richness of higher education in the system, but at a global level rather than at a national level. Only in the private sector you can do that. And for us, what I enjoy very much is exactly this type of discussion, actually looking at what higher education will be and how can we do that. You can do that more easily in the private sector. The partnerships with corporate clients is easier in the private sector than they are in the highly regulated, public funded universities. So yes, it's definitely also for my system something really exciting to engage with this, because I see it as one of the important tools in making that higher education much less locked up in boxes and compartments, and actually see learning as something which takes place in your entire life, in your entire career, but also in a kind of a just-in-time manner, and also mixing in the right way the skills, the professional skills you need to acquire in order to be successful, not just technical skills, but also leadership skills, teamwork skills, etc., with actually the ability to sometimes think completely outside the box. So not being stuck in a disciplinary box as well, but actually understanding that knowing something about another language, another culture, philosophy, or whatever, even though you might be studying engineering, actually can still be useful. COVID-19, and I don't want to get too excited, Marco, but COVID-19 is a perfect example of saying it cannot be solved by just one simple discipline, right? It is as much a medical problem as an economic problem, as a political issue, as you know, a social issue, etc., right? And if you want to be effective in addressing things like COVID-19, you have to be confident to work across those disciplines and to be able to think across those disciplines. If you're only locked up and say, well, COVID-19 is just a matter of how quickly do I get my new vaccine, you got a problem, because it's much bigger than that. Modern society isn't really confronting us with problems which we can solve with one simple discipline. So that open thinking is really what I'm passionate about. And micro-credentials, I think, are fitting in very well in that vision of what higher education really should be in the 21st century.
Mark, it could be risky asking Irishmen, are you for evolution or revolution? But I would like to hear from you what you think about it.
Well, I guess I can sit on both sides of that, because I'm originally from New Zealand. So, but at the same token, also a colonized country. So, a relevant statement. What I see again is, I'm going to come back to that word tension. But I'm also always mindful that if you're going to talk about something, you also have to do it. So we're trying to do some of this work in my current institution and the partners that we have. And I'm reminded by a quote that I wouldn't normally use in Ireland from Winston Churchill. And Churchill once said, "We build our dwellings, and the dwellings we build shape our lives." So I see this very much as about building the architecture. Or alternatively, I think I may have referred previously to an ecology. And it's complex, but we have the ability to shape this. If we didn't think we could, then I wouldn't be around this panel right now. And in many respects, I think the discussion about micro-credentials needs to move away from the reactive to the proactive, less about education in change to more about education for change and the kind of change we're looking to achieve. So on the one hand, I'm less optimistic about the disruptive element, because you could argue that a postgraduate certificate is already a micro-credential of a master's, and that what we're doing is just credentialing that into a more unbundled micro form. And in some degree, I've probably argued that here when I've talked about the importance of frameworks and alignment, and I guess that's about the currency, consistency, and coherence, if you like. But on the other hand, there has to be more to it than that, because why would we bother be talking about micro-credentials if all we were doing were just introducing another layer of smaller qualification? So in my own experience, we're working with two, what I would call disruptive projects, quite deliberately to push our own boundaries and our own thinking, and so we can learn. One of them, as you mentioned at the outset of my introduction, and what we're doing with FutureLearn. We see that very much as an opportunity to try to do things differently outside of the mainstream. It's not about institutional branding. It's about lessons that we can learn. In our case, we've actually been able to formally get micro-credentials recognized in a credit-bearing stackable form because of that initiative. And we wouldn't have been able to do that in our institution, I'm pretty confident to say previously. But far more, I think, potentially disruptive than that, or perhaps more future focused, because that word disruption is a bit overused in many respects. You know, elite universities have very little to gain from being disrupted. They'll prevent disruption, I would argue, at the best of times. Why would they want anything to threaten their status? So we're involved in what's known as the ECI University. ECI is the European Consortium for Innovative Universities. I've just got a link in the chat box. This was one of the European Commission's university alliances that was funded last year, and micro-credentials and micro-learning experiences are core to this partnership of, I think, 13 European universities. Now, the ECIU as a consortium has been in existence for over 20 years. So we're leveraging on an existing partnership. But what's unique is our commitment to share small units of learning that lead to something, a micro-credential. We're still working what that might mean. And the other thing that's a little unique about this, actually anchored around a signature pedagogy. We haven't talked that much about pedagogy in this discussion. We've talked a lot about pathways, lifelong learning, but how can we leverage micro-credentials to enhance the learning experience itself in the way that we, I'm hesitant to say deliver, in the way that we co-construct that with learners. So in this case, we've put a commitment to a particular form of pedagogy, one that is anchored into the Sustainable Development Goals, SCOL 11 actually, around smart cities and communities in particular. And if COVID-19 hasn't taught us anything, we need to be thinking smart thinking in the future. So that's something I just invite people to have a look at. It's funded by the European Commission. It's a 3-year initiative that at the end of it, we would like to believe that we'll have 12 to 13 universities with shareable qualifications that can stack. So we're committed to credit bearing, but we're also committed to what I described as the honeycomb mode, or rather than maybe extracurricular, the co-curricular. So in other words, this is something that's not running in parallel or that's extra or alternative, but can be woven within the existing curriculum and add value. So those are 2 examples. We're learning a lot. We're learning that this is very complex work, because I don't know, those who come from institutions, it's very hard to get 2 institutions working together and their systems talking to each other. That's a reality, let alone 13, or taking that even more globally. What is interesting is technology matters here. The platforms to make this happen. So I did talk about pedagogy, and I usually prefer to talk about pedagogy than technology, but platforms and systems are important. The European Commission has a huge investment in the Europass, and we'll be relaunching that as a platform to keep as a body of learning and your qualifications. In our case, we're working with Digitry, which is the platform that Canada just recently accepted and committed to for its micro-credentialing and credentialing framework, and both Australia and New Zealand use the same platform. So there's a common platform that helps institutions share. I'll stop on that note because that's a little technical, but what I can tell you, it does get down to the nuts and bolts to make it really happen.
It seems that we have just wrapped up the topic, and it becomes more and more interesting, but unfortunately our time is running out. I would like to launch one more poll before we start responding to questions from the audience. This poll would be related with how do you see the future of micro-credentials? So I would invite you all to vote. Okay, so let's share the results. The majority of you said that micro-credentials would integrate to some extent with formal education as a supplement to degrees. Let's try to reflect this poll result with some of the questions we have received from the audience. And few of those were related with recognition and accreditation. So first, if you think that it would be supplement to degrees, then this part is more related with recognition than accreditation. And it is very obvious and very clear that employers are already recognizing micro-credentials as a valuable proof of of knowledge or competence of potential candidates who are applying for jobs. Of course, we just tackled the platforms for micro-credentialing, and I would like to add also the ontology or taxonomy, how the learning achievements certified through micro-credentials may be recognized or read by employers in order to find the best candidates. But if you focus more that micro-credentials will become a part of the degree system or even replace the degree system, yes, then we have to discuss about the accreditation as well. And we are all aware that accreditation processes are maybe even more inert than the universities as such. And Professor Maurice mentioned something really about public universities, which is a fact that we are talking about very slow and inert systems, which are very, let's say, very critical to any kind of change. So accreditation systems are trying to pick up on micro-credentials mostly through if universities are ready to recognize them as a part of degree system. If not, there are just few qualification frameworks worldwide which are already recognizing micro-credentials as a part of qualifications framework system, mostly in a stackable way, but still we are looking for the solutions to find how this process of big recognition of the big picture from all of the external stakeholders would come to the table. Ms. Sharuk, do you have any experience when it comes to recognizing micro-credentials as a part of qualification frameworks?
Well, this hasn't, definitely this hasn't taken place yet. However, we are currently making use of micro-credentials as an aspect of extracurricular activities to support the programs or the new programs that are being rolled out within the education system, and also to link you know, the technical education with higher education. But recognition has not yet taken place, beyond the private sector, of course.
When it comes also to this communication between the employers and education or learners records, Kathleen, can you give us some thoughts about what are the newest experiences in the States when it comes to this communication? How employers actually recognize what micro-credentials mean for them?
So what we're seeing in the States, Dr. Marco, is universities partnering with local businesses to ensure that whatever micro-credential program they're putting in place suits the needs of the surrounding community. And so that's where we're seeing it being successful, when there's a dialogue, so that corporations or organizations and universities aren't moving down separate paths, but they're moving together. And again, it's very much dependent on the region where the university is and the type of student body that they attract. But that's where we're seeing the recognition happening, is when you can actually link what the employers need with what universities can provide.
Professor Maurice started very interesting point, and this is how to get the real buy-in for the new model. And I would like to share a few thoughts how we are looking on this at higher colleges of technology. So we consider that our main first step in pushing towards micro-credentialing would be to unbundle our current curricula, having in mind that currently we have curricula which consists of courses, and those courses as units are not separately recognized at the labor market. And even if we issue a transcript of a learner who has stopped his studies at the mid of the bachelor, these transcripts would not mean anything, neither to learner nor to employer. So under presumption that each course would be a micro-credential, for example, would already give an additional benefit to learner to prove a certain competence to employer at the situation that studies are stopped at some point before graduation. Of course, it doesn't work that way all the way through. So by modularizing or grouping some of those deconstructed or unbundled elements, we are tending to build portions which would be really tailored towards certain needs of the industry. Currently, the local industry in the UAE needs mid-level professionals, let's say technicians in the engineering sector. And if we manage to provide certain directions or certain concentrations for the technicians in certain sectors, by grouping modules or micro-credentials which evolve from the current curricula, we would be able to respond to the employer needs, but in the same time, we would be able to justify what we are doing with education bodies. So we are not disrupting what we have. Our final product would remain, for example, diploma or bachelor degree, and the content of education basically would evolve through different stages up to the certain level. And maybe we would give a bit more, so there would be some elements which would be an extension or expansion of curricula in order to tailor what industry may request or require. But from the point of accreditation or recognition, we hope that we will not hit the wall. So this is how we see this to happen. But one of the additional questions which we have received is about the currency. Currently, we are having credit as a main currency of post-secondary education, and this credit is not related only with the time student is spending within the learning process, but also with the financing of higher education. If we presume that new currency would be competence, what do you think? How this would reflect on for example, financing higher education, especially in the public sector? Maurice.
Right. I don't think the public sector will be particularly excited about that because it obviously messes up the system they're used to. And that's underneath the entire discussion we are having at the moment. So obviously you can look at higher education as a very much a top-down system, whereby you have the ministry, regulator, the university, the school and courses, etc., and it kind of works its way top-down. And then if you have micro-credentials, basically that can be very, very disruptive, as the word we used earlier. And then you can say, okay, how can we accommodate that? And we can do that by stealth, through using the back door, by doing it extracurricular and allowing it in without it actually disrupting the system. Or as you said, Marco, saying, well, actually it isn't disrupting the system because you already have it, and we break up the programs and now you see you got already something similar. The question is, why to bother, right? In my view, if you really want to do something new, you should focus not on the top-down acts, but actually go to the user, the end user. That's really where your change will happen. Will the end user embrace this or not? Can you convince the end user to embrace this or not? And I'll base this on my own experience, right? So I'm obviously a little bit older than some of you. And, you know, one of my first jobs was in 1985, Erasmus University, make it international. Okay, let's do student exchanges. Let's do joint, you know, all the discussions, why it could not be done, because of student accommodation, credit transfer, this and that, all kind of rules and regulations. And the only answer to that is, you're all right, it cannot be done, but let's do it anyway, right? And I have always used that principle in my life. The same when I went to the University of Westminster in '93, was the same kind of principle. Hey, this is not a top-ranked university. It's not research-led. Therefore, how are you going to make that really an attractive university? You know what, you do different. You do it differently. You bring in professional master degrees. So someone can have gone and done, let's say, political economy at LSE. That's great. They have earned their credentials that they are smart, but actually they don't really know that much, which is useful to the workplace. So now they come to the University of Westminster to do a master degree in, let's say, human resources. Right? And so we grew the master degrees enormously, also internationally and so on. What is important sometimes is not always to adjust your game to the rules of the others, which is top down, but actually just play your own game and ignore sometimes those rules a little bit. And global university systems is the same example. It's completely built on the thing that we know what students want to study wherever in the world, what they want to study for what fee level, etc. We create a system around that, what students want to study, rather than having a university and a course and we're trying to recruit students to it. It's turning things upside down. And I think with micro-credentials, that would be my advice as well. Focus on the end user. You got different end users. You got end users who are young, who want to earn the badges and so on in order to put themselves in a stronger place in the marketplace. Universities are not against it. Some universities might even be supportive to it. But actually the main question is, what does the student feel has value when it comes to getting a job? That means that employers also need to say they value what the students have earned in terms of badges and so on. Whether they get credits for it or not is not actually the most important and exciting question. The other one, of course, is probably even more exciting, and that is students who already have earned their academic credentials, but they want to continue developing themselves, which is absolutely crucial in order to be successful in a modern society. When I was at Nijrode University, you know, you mentioned at the Dutch University, I was Rector Magnificus and Chief Executive of. Actually, more than half of our income came from non-degree programs, right? Getting students to come on the degree program, very expensive, especially in that setting, because it was a private university with a castle, etc., hugely expensive. But what we also knew is that actually a lot of students wanted to come back or wanted to join us when they went up the career ladder and they became, let's say, a non-executive director. What do you need to know as a non-executive director? That's what you learn when you become a non-executive director. You don't teach that when someone is an undergraduate, right? So it's that kind of thinking whereby actually employers show that they believe in it by paying for it, right? And that's ultimately how employers show whether they feel it's value or not. To give someone a job with it, but most importantly, when they're actually willing to open their wallet and say, this is very important for my employees to continue developing themselves, and micro-credentials actually fit perfectly in that. So play another game, focus on the end user, look at the stakeholders, maybe focus a little bit less on the trying to disrupt the current system. Probably the top universities will be there in a couple of centuries still, but you know, it's not my role to disrupt them. It's just my role to serve, you know, students and society in the most effective way. And that's not always by playing the game according to those rules. Just make your own rules. Make your own game. That's my advice.
Thank you very much. I think that time is pushing us to wrap up this discussion. I would really like to conclude this with a very important thing, that micro-credentials are offering us an opportunity to provide a service where all learning matters. And this is very important for learners of the future. We don't know what will be the requirements of the future. We don't know how future would look like. But if we manage to provide a system where all learning would matter and be able to stuck and direct in a way learners would like or appreciate, as Morris just said, regardless of type of learning, mode of learning, delivery of learning, institution which provides this learning, we will be on the right track. As educators, we have only two ways to move forward: either to sit and see what would happen, or to pull the most preferable future and go for it. And this is really what it seems is a part of agenda of all of the panelists this evening. I would like to thank you all for the very fruitful discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that we will continue it at some point. And I would like to give a floor to Dr. Nariman to wrap up and thank her once more for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much, our esteemed panelists. I think that the topic of micro-credentials and digital badges is timely, but it's very complex to be able to address in just an hour and a half. So we should have planned for the 3 or 4 hours panel. So hopefully when we come back in September, we will follow up on the discussion. I think that we have had some outstanding insights on the future of micro-credential and digital badges. I liked what Professor Morris was talking about, the emotional resistance. I think that's something that both the sector and, even for certain industries is still going to be a challenge. It's something we're going to have to work through. But I think that we had some really good insights around, the opportunities that micro-credentials are providing. And hopefully there'll be future discussions where we will talk more about this particular topic. I know that for the UAE and for many countries in the Arab region, we still have challenges around issues of recognition and accreditation and standards and having to comply with requirements. And hopefully, with time and, a lot of our external quality assurance agencies probably learned from the pandemic and from what has happened. So once again, I thank you, Dr. Marco, for effectively facilitating this discussion. I thank all our panelists for their outstanding contribution. Thank you, Professor Brown, for sharing lots of useful resources that I'm sure our participants will value. We will see you again in September. Just for those of you who are interested, CLIX will be running its last 2 webinars on rethinking student assessment in online environment and course design this week, tomorrow and on Thursday. And we will resume our public activities in September again. Until then, please stay safe and accept our best wishes, and ma'a salama. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Marco. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
You kept us under control. Very good. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Mark, very, very useful. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye. Bye-bye.